I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What do we got today?
So today we're looking at Zhuangzi's Butterfly Dream,
which is one of the most famous passages in classical Chinese literature texts. Whether or not this is literature or philosophy is open discussion. Yeah. But most people who've read something in classical Chinese or from that tradition know this story.
It's constantly being referenced in classical literature, yeah.
And is often seen as sort of an ancient forerunner to a lot of the concerns that animate postmodernism. So, what do we know about Zhuangzi, Lee? Ground us here.
So, we don't actually know if Zhuangzi existed in real life. We think he probably did, and for the sake of simplicity, we're going to just pretend like he does exist. We're going to call him
Zhuangzi.
Zhuangzi, yeah. He is, if he did exist, he's a warring states figure, so 400 to 200 BCE. He's one of this kind of many philosophers who are roaming around China, like spouting off philosophical things. He's particularly important for the school that formed later, which was called Taoism. Taoism is made up of, the foundational text are Zhuangzi's text and the Tao Te Ching, which was supposedly written by Lao Tzu, but who we really don't think was a real dude.
Or that there are suspicions he's not a real dude.
Yeah. And then Confucius, sort of the founder of this Confucianism, along with Mencius.
And both are, we refer to both as schools. In the same way we refer to Zhuangzi as a real person, it's an easy handle. Most modern thinkers now they're aware that there wasn't a thing called Confucianism. No one said, hey, I'm a Confucianist. There would be classical, ancient texts.
In fact, the word Confucianism is actually a Western invention.
Yes.
The word in Chinese is just Ru, or Rujia.
Which could be a lot of things. Ru does not mean Confucius.
It just means essentially like scholar. So these schools are made up completely.
Yeah. So what we're dealing with when we're talking about Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu versus Confucius and Mencius, or Kongzi and Lao Tzu, is two branches of thought that are, in most things, very much, I don't know if I'd go as far as say opposed, but in some cases they are opposed.
They are absolutely
And the proponents of both they don't get along very well. They make fun of each other. The Confucianists say all Taoists are just ditterers who wander the land thinking about random stuff and not applying their knowledge to society.
And one of the things that's great about reading Zhuangzi is that he just body slams Confucius.
He goes at Confucius over and over again. And if Confucius calls Taoists a bunch of ramblers, Zhuangzi likes striking back at Confucius as someone who really doesn't understand what he's talking about. He's talking about things like states and citizens as though he knows what states and citizens are, when in fact he has no idea what they are, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So Zhuangzi's Butterfly Dream is going to get at the root of that, because one of the foundational thoughts in Zhuangzi's, I don't know if you'd call it even a system, in the texts anyway, is the sense that it all depends on where you're standing.
So relativism.
Very much
perspectivalism, I guess.
Yeah, in a lot of his early little anecdotes, for example, there are stories of, say, the god of the North Sea arguing with the god of one of the rivers in China. Or not one of the rivers, the river, the Yellow River.
Yeah.
And the god of the Yellow River saying things like, oh, I know what it means to be great because I wind through the land, et cetera, et cetera. And the god of the North Sea says, you have no idea what it is to be great because I stretch from horizon to horizon. And the basic idea is, how do you know you're big unless it's compared to something that's smaller?
Yeah.
And compared to something that's bigger than you, you're small. So how do you know if any of these things even exist?
And you should be very careful about being smug, because as soon as you encounter some other kind of comparison that's not favorable to you.
So that's going to ground us in Zhuangzi's Butterfly Dream. Do you want to just translate it for us, Lee? It's real short.
Yeah, it's a very short passage. I'll just go ahead and try and translate it. Once Zhuangzhou dreamed he was a butterfly flittering about, and he was happy with himself, doing just as he pleased. He did not realize that he was Zhou. Suddenly he awoke, and abruptly he was Zhou. He did not know whether he was Zhou, who was dreaming he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhou. Between Zhou and the butterfly there must be some sort of distinction. This is called the transformation of things.
And this gets at something you will see throughout Zhuangzi, or the Zhuangzi, or Zhuangzi's texts, which is a resolution that doesn't feel like a resolution. His resolution here is there has to be a difference, and then this is what is called the transformation.
Can I just ask you first
Go
off?
for it.
So this is the thing that's always troubled me about this passage. What is the transformation of things?
Exactly.
What is that? I mean, is it saying that the butterfly, like the distinction between the butterfly and the human, it's constantly transforming, or what?
Well, you know what's funny? One of the things that often gets paired with this, and one of the reasons I think Zhuangzi became more fascinating to 20th century thinkers, is a lot of the developments in science and philosophy in the 20th century go this direction. Because what Zhuangzi says is this is the transformation, which means, in other words, you can't ever understand a thing in a discrete moment. Like, am I Zhuangzi right now? And I should point out real quick, too, when we translate Zhuangzhou, that's Zhuangzi.
Yeah, sorry.
It uses a different character.
Zhuangzhou is his given... So Zhuang is his last name, Zhou is his given name, and Zhuangzi is his kind of...
Zi is sort of like another term for
name.
master or something.
So Master Zhuang.
Yeah. So take something like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says you can know the location of a thing or the direction of a thing, but you can't know both. Because as soon as you have nailed down where something is, it's moved. So this would be Zhuangzi's overall point. I'm Zhuangzi now, but in 3 seconds I'm something different. So the essence of this thought process is, what do you mean when you say that a thing is something? Because it changes all the time.
So I just want to point out, Rob is suggesting that a Chinese philosopher from 2,000 years ago invented relativity. The Chinese invented relativity 2,000 years ago.
That's exactly
Rob
right.
Moore said today.
I'm on the record. Heisenberg didn't know what he was talking about.
He was just copying George.
This is a Chinese guy that did it without any telescopes or people in science labs.
No, but I think you bring up an interesting point. You know, this does seem to kind of foreshadow a lot of things that are going on in the 20th century, a lot of philosophical and scientific concerns that are really interesting. What is it doing in this kind of 2,000 years ago?
Well, this is one of the reasons why the Confucianists thought Taoists were a bunch of ditterers who just sat on a riverbank looking and thinking.
And we should say, like, this text was not... I mean, it's incredibly popular in Chinese philosophy and Chinese literature, but not nearly as popular as, like, the Confucian text.
It hasn't had the impact Confucian texts have. It's had more of an impact on art and literature than Confucius has. But one of the things that keeps Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and their sort of intellectual descendants from being more important is this thought process. There's a notion in Taoism that you don't actually try to affect change in things. And one of the reasons is, how do you know if you're the butterfly or you're the person? What exactly are you changing, and into what? If you can't ever be sure of that, how do you know if what you're doing is good or if it's actually really bad?
It's an incredibly unstable world that Zhuangzi presents us with, as should be apparent with this, short butterfly dream.
Right.
You can't really build a state on that. You can't be a bureaucrat. When I was hitchhiking in Taiwan, I mentioned to someone that I was interested in Zhuangzi and I loved the butterfly dream. And they said, Zhuangzi is something you shouldn't read until you're retired. Confucius, you need to be reading right now. Zhuangzi, wait until you're 60.
Right.
And I think there's a real kind of, that's very important in kind of Chinese cultures. Like, don't read Zhuangzi now. And, he can't do you any good if you're trying to, like, build something up. That's what Confucianism is for.
Yeah.
But we see that here. Like, we can't even, we opened it up with what's this transformation of things. It sounds simple, but it's a very complex idea that we can't even figure out what he's meaning.
And what I love about Zhuangzi, and this, for those of you who think, this is nice, but it's really complicated, and it's not really why I go to literature.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about Zhuangzi is you're never 100% sure if he's putting forth a deeply thought out philosophical idea, or if he's just messing with
exactly.
you. Or if he's just messing with you. No, he does it.
That is the transformation of things.
Exactly. No, we get excited about this because it's true. He's one of the great smartasses in the history of Chinese literature. I'm not even kidding. He'll do these profound parables, and then the explanation is he's just sort of just needling somebody, but it's so beautifully written. So I'm thinking specifically here about one of the many. There's so many stories actually with Zhuangzi and his friend, or the butt of his jokes, Huizi. And in the story, Zhuangzi and Huizi are walking across this bridge, and they stop. And Zhuangzi and Huizi are looking down at the fish. And Zhuangzi says, "Clearly, those are happy fish." And Huizi says, "How do you know what fish are thinking?" And Zhuangzi says, "How do you know I don't know what fish are thinking?" And Huizi says, "Well, you're clearly not a fish, so there's no way you could know that." And it goes back and forth like this. And the resolution doesn't feel like a resolution at all. It seems more like Zhuangzi just trying to string Huizi along. And it may be that.
Yeah. And we've got something like that here. This story is... Do you think it's intended to have a resolution?
I don't know. I think this is the question we always come back to with Zhuangzi. Does he have a point? Or is he intentionally trying to disrupt the way most people think to force them out of these notions that it must be this and nothing else?
So we've connected him to Heisenberg and 20th century physics. Can we connect him to Silicon Valley and 21st century economics? Is he the disruptor in chief of all of Chinese philosophy?
I'm thinking so. I think now we've got him connected to Silicon Valley. We should see if we can branch out into other areas.
Oh, could we brand him?
Brand him. I love it. Make T-shirts.
So one thing we wanted to discuss is whether this is philosophy, history, or literature.
What genre we're talking about here, yeah. What's your take?
I don't know. Again, I think that, we're dealing with a text where genres that so it's written, 2,000 years ago, so genre as we think of it is not perhaps that relevant. Right. They may have had genres that they were thinking of, but I don't know that we necessarily have access to them. Mm-hmm. So I think to a certain degree, it's a bit artificial to have this debate to say, oh, he's philosophy and not literature, or he's literature and not philosophy.
Sure.
The way I categorize literature is essentially a narrative told with the intention of being beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I would say, yeah, he does fit in that, even though he brings up some philosophical issues. If he's a philosopher, he's a very literary philosopher. If he's a literature guy, he's a very philosophical literature guy.
I think that's the thing, is for me...
It's the transformation of things.
It's the transformation of things. There's no nailing it down. So for the ease of sort of comparison, when I'm thinking sort of Western philosophy, the approach and what's expected is a little different. You're expecting precision. So you have someone like Descartes in the 17th century, who the whole "I think, therefore I am" posits an interestingly similar problem. It's like, take away everything that you can possibly know. Everything. What's left? How can I know anything? Well, the fact that I can think at all. And he expounds at length on what that means. Whereas here, Zhuangzi is saying something similar. How do I know that I'm me here and not this thing over there? And his conclusion is, arguably, you don't. You don't really know.
Yeah, this definitely brings to mind the evil demon of Cartesian philosophy. Yeah. Like, you can't know to a certain degree. Right?
You could be being fed data or dreams, and you don't know what you're thinking or why.
It is the Matrix.
Yeah. But for me, the reason I think of this as literary is that literature, for me, doesn't need to resolve its problems. The whole point of having something like a novel rather than a philosophical treatise is because you're allowed to explore, and you don't have to solve. The whole point is to bring a reader into a world and maybe even force them to grapple with some of these things and on their own come up with conclusions and things like that. Here, Zhuangzi's positing this dream. We should bear in mind it's a dream. He's not saying, the other day I was just thinking, and I wondered if it's something that he, at least if we understand the text correctly, is experiencing, right? And from that experience, he presents us with something he doesn't resolve for us, which for me is an invitation to consider it, perhaps even experience it for ourselves, to draw what conclusions we will.
So we're talking about resolutions, and I hate to do this, but I have to jump to another story in the Zhuangzi.
Oh, no.
Which is the death of Wantan.
Okay, go for it.
Essentially what happens is two friends of this guy named Wantan, they think that he would love a couple of holes in him, so they try and nail him down. And in nailing him down, they kill him. And I think that we're seeing some of that here in the butterfly. Maybe we shouldn't want to nail down what the transformation of things is, this thing that he refers to. Maybe if we did nail it down, that would essentially kill whatever it is that Zhuangzi is talking about, kill the joy that we are having in this discussion. And that maybe is what literature is. Although even, I guess I should back up and say maybe we shouldn't even call it literature. Maybe we shouldn't even seek to define it, because in defining it as one thing, in putting it into this genre as literature, we are killing it.
Yeah.
We're putting nails in it.
It could be. I definitely think genre studies with some of these things that defy genres is a little self-defeating, especially given that historical writing wasn't even a thing for another couple of centuries after Zhuangzi.
Yeah.
So basically we're dealing with just sort of writing in general. So let's just kind of have some fun with this right here at the end. Let's try to answer the question.
What is the question, Rob?
The question is this Zhuangzi dreaming that he's a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuangzi?
I'm going to go out on a limb here, as a butterfly would, and suggest that he is the butterfly dreaming that he is Zhuangzi.
In what way?
Well, clearly no human has the intelligence to come up with something so funny as this. And so obviously it's the butterfly, this beautiful creature, dreaming that, maybe we should say having a nightmare, that he is Zhuangzi.
I'm going to go the reverse direction and go high school debate style.
Okay.
Just sort of arbitrarily. Partly because we have a text dealing with this. And someone has to have a reason to write this down.
You don't think a butterfly could write this down?
I'm fairly certain its limbs would not be strong enough to hold the pen.
I think you're not understanding what the concept of the transformation of things is.
Actually, you know what's funny? This whole discussion, no matter how we have this discussion, one of us could just pick apart the other side.
Yeah.
And this is essentially what Zhuangzi does throughout his text.
Absolutely what this whole thing is about. I think Zhuangzi may be looking down on us from heaven and saying,
smiling, this is what I want, is people to argue themselves into circles. But this is also, again, I want to stress this, because sometimes we talk about texts and people will wonder, what's the takeaway here? What am I, one of the things to take away from this is, if you're going to understand the development of Chinese culture across the millennia, you have to understand this collision between what amounts to the practicality, the pragmatism of Confucianism.
Which is bureaucratic.
Which is largely bureaucratic. Yeah, Confucius is interested in setting up a functional state. Well, I use the word state. Anyway, nation, we'll pick a different word, yeah. A group of people that work together well, right? Taoism is not necessarily interested in that. It's actually setting its sights beyond just people working together into, okay, well, how do people work with flowers? How do flowers work with the sky? How does they postulate this entire system, and within that system, there isn't necessarily greater importance on this thing or this thing.
Can I connect this to another 21st century thing that has no connection to it?
I have a 21st century reference as well, so go ahead.
So I was going to say, would you say Zhuangzi is an object-oriented ontologist?
I don't think we want to go there, Lee. That takes us into some really weird territory.
I mean, he's thinking about, like, not a human perspective, whereas Confucianist, it's very much the centralized state hierarchical perspective, the perspective from the center. So he's thinking from the margins. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to connect him to there's a Chinese science fiction writer named Liu Cixin, who won the Hugo and Nebula Awards, I think, for the three-body problem, he calls it. And it's the first part of a trilogy. Anyway, in an interview once, they were asking him, why'd you start writing science fiction? He said, I started writing science fiction because I think humans are boring. Like, I'm way more interested in things and skies and objects. And the novel is very much that way. It's human beings in the novel are clearly just one part of a much bigger system, and maybe not even the most important part of that system. And I really think this is sort of Zhuangzi's perspective, and the perspective of most of the people who we would label Taoists. It's also why they tends to be such influence on Chinese literature and art, because it lends itself to more speculation, dreaming.
We should mention, so we've done several podcasts on Pusong Ling.
Oh, yeah.
Pusong Ling is heavily informed by the butterfly dream because you're constantly shifting between different kinds of reality. And that starts with Zhuangzi and this butterfly dream.
Yeah, is it this or is it this? The answer, of course, is yes. But anyway, my parting thought about this and Zhuangzi in general is that it's one of the only serious texts I can think of that you can just read and laugh at as well. I think Zhuangzi would have delighted that future readers would read this butterfly dream and think about it for a while, and at the end just kind of shrug and laugh and walk away.
He's okay with thinking in circles, isn't he?
Yes. And I think that's a valuable contribution, because you do need to have someone in the room who goes, how do you know any of this is correct? Like, you keep using these words that you think you know.
And he's very skeptical of the ability not only to nail down anything, but specifically to nail down anything with language.
Exactly. So that's my parting thought. Do you have any parting thoughts?
Sweet dreams.
There it is. Hopefully you're not listening to this right before bed, because that could be very creepy. That's the last thing you hear.
Yeah.
So I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.